June 4, 1942. The crimson sun rose over the Pacific like a blood-soaked banner, casting its ominous glow across the churning waters northwest of Midway Atoll. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he surveyed the most formidable naval force Japan had ever assembled. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, cut through the waves in perfect formation, their decks bristling with the finest naval aircraft in the Imperial Navy's arsenal. The morning air carried the acrid scent of aviation fuel and the metallic tang of anticipation. Below deck, pilots prepared for what they believed would be another devastating blow against American forces, similar to their triumph at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Vice Admiral Nagumo had earned his reputation through precise execution and unwavering discipline, but on this morning, the weight of command pressed upon him like the Pacific depths themselves. At 0430 hours, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, 108 planes strong, lifted off from the carrier decks with thunderous roars that shattered the pre-dawn silence. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters formed up in the darkness, their navigation lights blinking like fallen stars against the ink-black sky. Their target, the American installations on Midway Atoll, a strategic stepping stone that would bring the Japanese fleet within striking distance of Hawaii itself. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga led the strike force with characteristic precision, his voice crackling over the radio as he coordinated the attack formation. The pilots under his command represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation, veterans of countless battles across the Pacific, their skill honed to a razor's edge through months of relentless combat. Each man understood that success at Midway would potentially force the Americans to negotiate peace terms favorable to the Empire. As the strike force disappeared into the morning haze, Admiral Nagumo faced his first critical decision of the day. Intelligence reports suggested American naval forces might be operating in the area, but the exact composition and location remained frustratingly unclear. The Japanese had broken American diplomatic codes, but had failed to penetrate the newly changed naval cipher systems. This intelligence gap would prove more consequential than anyone aboard the Akagi could have imagined. According to naval historian Gordon Prange's comprehensive analysis in Miracle at Midway, Japanese intelligence failures at this critical juncture stemmed from overconfidence in their code-breaking capabilities and insufficient reconnaissance efforts. The carrier decks buzzed with activity as ground crews prepared the second wave aircraft, their movements choreographed through countless hours of drill and practice. Torpedo bombers sat armed with the devastating Type 91 torpedoes, while dive bombers carried armor-piercing bombs designed to penetrate the thickest ship armor. The Japanese had learned from Pearl Harbor that surprise and overwhelming force could overcome any defensive preparation. Admiral Nagumo's staff officers clustered around plotting tables, updating positions and calculating strike timings with mechanical precision. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the Akagi's commanding officer, coordinated with his fellow carrier captains to maintain formation integrity while maximizing defensive capabilities. The Japanese had developed sophisticated carrier warfare tactics through years of innovation and combat experience, making their Kido Butai, the mobile strike force, the most feared naval formation in the Pacific. Yet beneath this veneer of professional competence, subtle tensions simmered. The rapid pace of Japanese expansion had stretched their most experienced officers thin, forcing many to operate on insufficient rest and mounting pressure. Admiral Nagumo himself had commanded the successful Pearl Harbor strike, but the burden of maintaining Japan's string of victories weighed heavily upon his shoulders. One miscalculation, one moment of hesitation, could unravel months of careful strategic planning. 0600 hours, the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist and revealing the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean. Admiral Nagumo's reconnaissance aircraft had launched at dawn, their mission to sweep the northern approaches and confirm the absence of American naval forces. The fate of the entire operation hinged upon these few aircraft and their ability to provide accurate intelligence about enemy positions. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tokuno piloted his Nakajima E-8 Dave floatplane through the morning sky, his experienced eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of American ships. The reconnaissance plan called for a comprehensive search pattern covering 240 degrees of ocean, but mechanical problems had already disrupted the carefully choreographed schedule. The cruiser Tone's No. 4 aircraft had experienced a critical catapult malfunction, creating a dangerous gap in the search pattern that would prove fateful in the hours to come. Meanwhile, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, lay bedridden in the Akagi's sickbay, suffering from acute appendicitis that had struck him down at the worst possible moment. His absence deprived Admiral Nagumo of his most trusted aviation advisor, precisely when such expertise was most desperately needed. The irony was not lost on Fuchida himself. The man who had led Japan's greatest naval victory was now powerless to influence what would become its greatest defeat. At 0700 hours, Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga's voice crackled over the radio from his position above Midway. "Enemy air power still intact," he reported, his tone professional despite the disappointing news. "Second attack necessary to neutralize airfield defenses." The American installations had proven more resilient than anticipated, their anti-aircraft fire more accurate than intelligence estimates had suggested. This single radio transmission would trigger the most consequential decision of Admiral Nagumo's career. The Admiral faced an excruciating dilemma. Should he immediately launch his second wave against the American fleet that might be lurking somewhere beyond the horizon? Or should he heed Tomonaga's recommendation and prepare for a second strike against Midway's stubborn defenses? Naval records from the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force archives, as documented by historian John Parshall in Shattered Sword, reveal that Nagumo's staff had extensively debated this exact scenario during pre-battle planning sessions. The clock showed 0715 when Admiral Nagumo made his fateful choice. "Prepare second wave for land targets," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of years of successful command. "Replace anti-ship torpedoes with land attack bombs." The decision seemed logical. Eliminate the American air threat from Midway, then deal with any naval forces that might appear later. Across the 4 carrier decks, ordnance crews sprang into action with practiced efficiency. Torpedoes were carefully removed from aircraft bellies and replaced with high-explosive bombs designed for land targets. The process required delicate handling. One spark, one moment of carelessness, could turn the carrier deck into an inferno. Chief Petty Officer Abe Mango supervised the ordnance transfer aboard the Kaga, his 20 years of experience guiding younger sailors through the dangerous procedure. But as the rearming operation progressed, Lieutenant Tokuno's voice suddenly broke the morning silence. "Enemy ship sighted!" The reconnaissance pilot's report sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. 10 vessels bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Admiral Nagumo's blood ran cold. The American fleet, if that's what Tokuno had spotted, was positioned exactly where Japanese intelligence had insisted no enemy forces existed. The careful calculations and strategic assumptions that had guided the Midway operation were crumbling with each word from the reconnaissance aircraft. "Identification of enemy ships requested," Nagumo radioed back, his voice maintaining professional calm despite the chaos erupting in his mind. The Admiral needed to know whether he faced cruisers and destroyers, manageable threats, or the aircraft carriers that could turn the entire battle on its head. Minutes passed like hours as the Japanese command staff waited for clarification. On the carrier decks, ordnance crews continued their work, unaware that each passing moment brought them closer to disaster. The bombs they were so carefully installing might soon prove useless against the very enemy they would face. 0800 hours. The morning sun blazed overhead as Lieutenant Tokuno's follow-up report shattered the last illusions aboard the Japanese flagship. "Enemy force includes what appears to be aircraft carrier," his voice transmitted across the static-filled radio waves. The words hit Admiral Nagumo's bridge like physical blows, each syllable carrying the weight of strategic catastrophe. Admiral Nagumo stared at the plotting board, where his staff officers frantically updated enemy positions. The American fleet, Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, had achieved the impossible. They had positioned themselves exactly where they could inflict maximum damage, while remaining undetected until this critical moment. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's brilliant air operations officer, stood beside the plotting table with his face pale as rice paper. Despite his reputation as one of Japan's finest tactical minds, Genda found himself confronting a scenario that defied all conventional wisdom. "Admiral," he said quietly, "we must decide immediately. Do we continue the Midway, strike or pivot to engage the American fleet?" The decision tree before Nagumo had become a nightmare of competing priorities. His first-wave aircraft were already approaching Midway and would need fighter cover for their return journey. The second wave sat on his carrier decks, half-armed, with land attack bombs that were useless against naval targets. Meanwhile, somewhere beyond the horizon, American aircraft carriers were almost certainly launching their own strikes against his force. According to declassified records from the Naval War College, as cited in Samuel Eliot Morrison's definitive History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, American codebreakers had provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with detailed intelligence about Japanese battle plans, allowing him to position his forces for maximum tactical advantage. At 0830 hours, Admiral Nagumo made the decision that would define the remainder of the battle. "Suspend second-wave preparations," he ordered. "Begin immediate rearmament with anti-ship weapons." The command rippled through the task force like a stone thrown into still water, creating expanding circles of frantic activity across all 4 carrier decks. Chief Aviation Ordnance Man Kiyoshi Abe, aboard the Soryu, received the rearmament order with growing dread. The bombs that had taken 45 minutes to install would now need to be removed and replaced with torpedoes, a process that required even more delicate handling. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he supervised his crew in the dangerous work of moving explosive ordnance across the crowded hangar deck. The Japanese had drilled endlessly for rapid aircraft turnaround, but they had never anticipated the need to completely rearm their entire second wave while simultaneously recovering the first wave from their Midway strike. The coordination required was beyond even their exceptional training standards, and mistakes were inevitable under such pressure. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Hashimoto, commanding Bombing Squadron 5 aboard the Shokaku, which had been reassigned to the Zuikaku for this operation, watched the chaos unfold with professional dismay. His pilots sat in their cockpits, engines warming, waiting for launch orders that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. Every minute of delay gave the Americans more time to close the distance and launch their own attacks. At 0900 hours, the situation deteriorated further when lookouts spotted the first American aircraft approaching from the southeast. Enemy torpedo planes, bearing 140 degrees. The shout echoed across the Akagi's bridge as anti-aircraft guns swiveled toward the new threat. Admiral Nagumo's carefully orchestrated battle plan was disintegrating into chaos. His first-wave aircraft were returning low on fuel and ammunition, demanding immediate recovery operations. His second wave remained trapped in the rearmament cycle, unable to launch against the American fleet. And now, enemy aircraft were beginning their attack runs against his most valuable assets. The irony was bitter and complete. The same tactical flexibility that had made the Japanese carrier force so devastating throughout the Pacific War had become their greatest vulnerability. Their ability to rapidly switch between different mission types, the hallmark of their success, had become a fatal liability when caught in transition between configurations. Commander Genda approached Admiral Nagumo with a face etched by the realization of impending disaster. "Sir," he said quietly, "we may have waited too long to make the pivot." 0930 hours. The Pacific morning erupted into chaos as the first wave of American torpedo bombers from the USS Hornet descended toward the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 in their obsolete Douglas TBD Devastators, their slow, lumbering approach making them easy targets for the experienced Japanese fighter pilots. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, tore through the American formation with savage efficiency. Admiral Nagumo watched from the Akagi's bridge as the American attack unfolded with tragic predictability. The torpedo bombers, flying barely 50 feet above the wave tops, pressed their attacks with suicidal determination despite the withering defensive fire. One by one, the devastators fell into the Pacific, their crews disappearing beneath the blue waters that would become their tomb. "All Hornet torpedo bombers destroyed," reported the Air Defense Coordinator, his voice carrying a mixture of professional satisfaction and grudging respect for the enemy's courage. Of the 15 aircraft in Torpedo Squadron 8, only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life raft and witnessing the battle's climactic moments from sea level. But the sacrifice of the American torpedo squadrons served a crucial purpose that Admiral Nagumo failed to recognize in the heat of battle. The low-level attacks had drawn his combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the upper altitudes virtually undefended. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from the USS Enterprise were approaching from 20,000 feet, invisible, to the Japanese fighters engaged with the torpedo planes below. This tactical development was later analyzed by the U.S. Naval Institute in their comprehensive battle study, demonstrating how the coordination of American air attacks, whether planned or coincidental, created the perfect conditions for the decisive blow. At 09:55 hours, the ordnance crews aboard the Japanese carriers were still frantically working to complete the rearmament process. Bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines cluttered the hangar decks of all 4 carriers. The scene was a powder keg waiting for a spark, and that spark was already diving toward them from the morning sky. Lieutenant Richard Best led his section of SBD Dauntless dive bombers in their screaming descent toward the Akagi, the Japanese flagship, with its distinctive red rising sun painted on the flight deck, made a perfect target for the American bombardiers. At 2,500 feet, Best released his 1,000-pound bomb, watching it arc downward toward the carrier's vulnerable flight deck. The bomb struck the Akagi just aft of the midships elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar where the rearming operations were in progress. The secondary explosions that followed turned the proud flagship into a floating inferno within minutes. Admiral Nagumo, thrown to the deck by the blast, struggled to his feet as smoke and flame engulfed his command center. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown struck the carriers Kaga and Soryu with devastating accuracy. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's attack on the Soryu was particularly destructive, with 3 direct hits turning the carrier into a blazing wreck in less than 6 minutes. The Kaga, struck by 4 bombs, began listing heavily to port as fires raged through her multiple decks. Commander Genda, his uniform singed by the explosions aboard the Akagi, helped Admiral Nagumo toward the ship's island structure. "Sir, we must transfer your flag," he shouted over the roar of flames and exploding ammunition. The admiral who had commanded the Pearl Harbor strike force was now witnessing the destruction of his own fleet in a reversal that seemed almost cosmic in its irony. The Japanese had always prided themselves on their ability to adapt and overcome tactical disadvantages through superior skill and determination. But there was no adapting to this disaster. 3 of their 4 aircraft carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted metal, and their hangar spaces blazing infernos. The carefully orchestrated battle plan had collapsed in a matter of minutes. Only the Hiryu remained operational, steaming frantically northward under the command of Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi. The lone surviving carrier represented Japan's last hope of salvaging something from the disaster, but she faced the entire American task force alone. Captain Tomio Kaku of the Akagi made the heartbreaking decision to abandon ship as fires reached the aviation fuel storage areas. The explosion that followed could be seen for miles, sending a column of black smoke into the clear Pacific sky like a funeral pyre for Japanese naval supremacy. 1100 hours rear, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese aircraft carrier, as smoke columns from his burning sister ships stained the horizon. A graduate of the Naval War College and former naval attaché to the United States, Yamaguchi understood better than most the catastrophic implications of losing 3 fleet carriers in a single morning. Yet his samurai spirit demanded one final strike against the American fleet. "Launch all available aircraft," Yamaguchi ordered, his voice steady despite the disaster unfolding around him. The Hiryu's flight deck erupted into activity as 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters prepared for what would likely be a one-way mission. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike force, knowing that his aircraft represented Japan's last chance to inflict meaningful damage on the American fleet. The American task force, commanded by Admiral Fletcher aboard the USS Yorktown, had achieved a victory beyond their wildest expectations. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed in exchange, for minimal losses seemed almost too good to be true. But Fletcher, a cautious and experienced commander, knew that the battle was far from over while even one enemy carrier remained operational. At 1130 hours, Kobayashi's dive bombers found their target. The Yorktown, her flight, deck busy with refueling operations, presented a tempting target for the desperate Japanese pilots. Despite intense anti-aircraft fire from the carrier's escorts, 3 bombs struck the American ship, causing serious damage and forcing her to reduce speed. According to the official U.S. Navy battle report, filed with the Chief of Naval Operations and later published in the Naval Institute Proceedings, the Yorktown's damage control teams performed magnificently under the most challenging conditions, keeping the ship operational despite severe structural damage. But the Japanese triumph was short-lived. American fighters from the Enterprise and Hornet decimated Kobayashi's strike force during their withdrawal, leaving only a handful of aircraft to return to the Hiryu. The exchange rate, 3 bomb hits for the loss of most of the strike force, demonstrated the hopeless nature of Japan's position. Admiral Yamaguchi, recognizing that his remaining aircraft were insufficient for decisive action, made the difficult decision to close with the American fleet and attempt a surface engagement. The Hiryu, escorted by her screening destroyers, turned southeast toward the last known position of the enemy carriers. Meanwhile, Admiral Spruance aboard the Enterprise was coordinating the final destruction of Japanese carrier aviation. His dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, located the fleeing Hiryu at 1600 hours. The lone Japanese carrier, despite desperate evasive maneuvers, could not escape the vengeful American aircraft. 4 direct bomb hits transformed the Hiryu into a blazing wreck within minutes. Admiral Yamaguchi, following the ancient code of Bushido, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the shame of defeat. His final radio message to the combined fleet was simple and dignified. "Hiryu proceeding to engage enemy. Expect to be sunk." Captain Tomeo Kaku, who had transferred to the destroyer Nowaki after abandoning the burning Akagi, watched the Hiryu's death throes with tears streaming down his face. The mobile strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had been completely annihilated in a single day. Admiral Nagumo, his flag now flying from the light cruiser Nagara, faced the most difficult decision of his naval career. The combined fleet's battle plan called for a surface engagement if the carrier strike failed, but with 4 fleet carriers lost and their trained aircrew at the bottom of the Pacific, continuation of the battle served no strategic purpose. Taipu, Japanese submarines that had been positioned to intercept fleeing American ships, found themselves witnesses to their own fleet's retreat. Commander Tanabe of the I-168 watched helplessly as the proud vessels of the mobile strike force limped westward, their mission a complete failure. As darkness fell over the Pacific battlefield, the magnitude of Japan's defeat became clear. 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, their highly trained aircrew, and most importantly, the aura of invincibility that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, all lay beneath the waves near Midway Atoll. The failed pivot at Midway's turn had cost Japan not merely a battle, but potentially the entire war. June 5, 1942 dawn broke over a Pacific Ocean transformed by the events of the previous day. The waters around Midway Atoll, which had witnessed the most decisive naval battle since Trafalgar, now held the wreckage of Japanese ambitions scattered across the ocean floor. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, aboard his flagship Yamato far to the west, received the catastrophic reports with the stoicism of a man who had predicted this very outcome. The architect of Pearl Harbor had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months to a year, but after that, American industrial might would begin to tell. His prophecy had proven accurate to the month. Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the tide of war had turned decisively against the empire of the rising sun. Admiral Nagumo, standing on the bridge of the cruiser Nagara as his shattered fleet limped toward home, contemplated the series of decisions that had led to this disaster. The intelligence failure that had concealed the American fleet's position, the fatal delay in launching the second wave, the tragic timing of the rearmament operation. Each element had contributed to a perfect storm of defeat. Commander Genda, his face bearing the burns from the Akagi's destruction, worked feverishly to compile the after-action reports that would somehow explain the inexplicable to Imperial Naval Headquarters. How could 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable aircrew be lost in a single morning to an enemy that was supposed to be caught by surprise? The human cost was staggering beyond the mere numbers. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga, who had led the morning strike against Midway, was among the missing, presumed killed. His expertise in carrier aviation tactics represented decades of training and combat experience that could never be replaced. Across the 4 sunken carriers, similar stories played out. Veteran pilots, skilled mechanics, and experienced deck crews all lost to the Pacific depths. Post-war analysis by the Japanese Defense Agency, as documented in their official history, the Imperial Japanese Navy in World War II, revealed that the loss of trained personnel at Midway was even more catastrophic than the loss of the ships themselves, as Japan's training programs could not replace such experienced aviators. On Midway Atoll itself, the American defenders, who had endured the morning bombardment, emerged from their shelters to witness the smoke columns marking the Japanese fleet's funeral pyres. Major Lofton Henderson's Marine aviators, despite suffering heavy losses during their attacks on the enemy carriers, had played their part in the victory that would be remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War. Admiral Chester Nimitz, receiving the battle reports at Pearl Harbor, allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The intelligence breakthrough that had revealed Japanese intentions, the careful positioning of his outnumbered fleet, and the courage of American aviators had combined to achieve a victory that few had thought possible just days earlier. But the victory came at a price that extended beyond the immediate tactical success. The USS Yorktown, struck by Japanese bombs and torpedoes, would succumb to her wounds despite heroic damage control efforts. The destroyer Hammond, attempting to assist the carrier, was also lost to enemy submarine attack. Even in defeat, the Japanese had extracted a toll from their conquerors. As the sun set on June 5, 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific had been fundamentally altered. Japan's carrier aviation, the spearhead of their expansion across the Pacific, had been broken as an effective fighting force. The initiative that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean had passed irrevocably to the Americans. Admiral Yamamoto, studying the battle reports in his cabin aboard the Yamato, understood that Japan's brief moment of naval supremacy had ended at Midway's turn. The failure to pivot, to adapt to changing tactical circumstances with the speed and flexibility that had characterized Japanese success, had cost them not just a battle, but the war itself. The mobile strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months was gone, scattered across the ocean floor along with the dreams of Japanese empire. In their place rose a new reality. America's industrial might, guided by superior intelligence and executed by increasingly experienced crews, would now drive the war inexorably toward Japan's home islands. The sun that had risen like a blood-soaked banner over the Japanese fleet now set like a funeral shroud over their ambitions. At Midway's turn, the Pacific War had pivoted from Japanese expansion to American advance, and that pivot would never be reversed.